start my speech today as properly scripted by my team, talking about my common sense plan to axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, and stop the crime. But I was interrupted by the testimony I just read from our very own Prime Minister just yesterday. He said something incredible, although not so surprising. Of course, what we're investigating is whether a foreign dictatorship interfered in our democracy in multiple elections to help him win. A communist dictatorship seeking to keep in office someone who said he admires that communist dictatorship. But his defense actually speaks for itself. The Prime Minister was asked why he didn't do anything about this interference, even though he was warned in briefing notes, is that he doesn't read briefing notes. Now, we often don't believe the things that this guy says, but I think that most Canadians would believe that defense. I think it's plausible that Justin Trudeau doesn't read documents that come before him. In fact, I think it's likely that he doesn't read things that come before him. And I think that that defense is interesting for three reasons. One, because the ivory tower elites who support him and his ideology of concentrating all the power in their and money in their hands, they always tell us how wonderfully sophisticated and cosmopolitan they are, how brilliant they are, and that's why they're entitled. They're experts, after all, right? That's why they're entitled to decide for other people. But yet they're prepared to support a guy who says he doesn't read. It's like, he might be a know-nothing, but he's our know-nothing, right? They support a guy who confuses decimals with decibels, who says budgets balance themselves, even when they never do, who says he doesn't think much about monetary policy, admits he's not very good with numbers, advises Canadians to pay for their tuition and their home renovations on their credit card. And this is the bright light, the genius that they believe should be able to run the lives of mechanics who are able to take apart an engine and put it back together with blindfolds on, that the single mom who can balance her budget on a minimum wage salary needs advice on budgeting from the guy who can't budget for himself. That is the ultimate irony of the elitism, is that these pseudo-intellectuals vest all their faith in this guy of all people. The second thing that's so interesting, and this came up, by the way, in his defense on another scandal, when he had accepted a $250,000 free vacation from someone who had met with him asking for, and later received, a $15 million grant from his government. It's the kind of cronyism that would get a small-town mayor put in jail. But the defense the Prime Minister gave at the time was that in the meeting, he didn't actually, it wasn't substantially important, because he actually doesn't run the government. He's a ceremonial figurehead. And therefore, he didn't have any actual power over the government he heads to give the individual what he was asking for in exchange for that famous free vacation. Even though, in the Prime Minister's own Open and Accountability Guide, the machinery of government, and that's a quote, is the exclusive responsibility of the Prime Minister, which brings me to the second reason why his "I don't read my briefing notes" defense is so interesting. And it is this: he wants all the power and none of the responsibility. He literally wants to control the entire economy. He wants to nationalize large industries with monstrous taxpayer-funded subsidies, and yet he wants to print $600 billion without having any responsibility for the resulting inflation. He wants to increase the cost of government without taking any of the blame for the resulting interest payments that households must pay on their own debt after he drove up the rates. He wants none of the responsibility for the fact that we have the slowest economic growth in the OECD over the next 5 years and over the next 35 years, after he promised all this spending was going to stimulate the contrary. He wants to have total control over what you can see and say online, to protect us all from these dangerous forces that might influence our thinking if we're not protected by the angels in the government. And yet, when there is actually a risk of manipulation by hostile and malicious actors, like, say, a communist regime in Beijing, he can't even take the responsibility of reading his briefing notes. This is the irony, the great irony of his leadership, and one of the reasons why I think he's succeeded in doubling housing costs, giving us the worst inflation in 40 years, sending 2 million people to the food banks, 8,000 people signing up for a Facebook group called the Dumpster Diving Network because they now have to eat out of a garbage can after he drove food prices rising with his carbon tax. He wants to control every aspect of your life. And then when he ruins your life, he wants to take none of the responsibility for the ruin that he caused. And the third reason why this testimony and this entire scandal is so consequential and indicative is why the hell did a dictatorship, a communist dictatorship, on the other side of the world consider it such a strategic imperative to keep this guy as prime minister? What was their motive? Why did they believe that they would be better off by having him as our prime minister in at least 2 elections where they intervened to help him win? Why? Because he's good for Canada? Or is it because he admires their basic Chinese communist dictatorship? He admits that he admires Fidel Castro, and his policy agenda would seem to point in that direction. And that direction is the topic of my speech today, because it is a radical departure from the common sense Canadian way. And if you want to know about that common sense Canadian way, take a walk in the town center of Saskatoon. Why? Anybody from Saskatoon here? Well, there's 2 reasons why you should do that. One, because, of course, Saskatoon is my mother's hometown, so it's a historic place, and a very important place. And the second reason is that you will see a beautiful pair of statues together of a paper boy named John Diefenbaker selling a newspaper to Wilfrid Laurier. Laurier was in Saskatoon on July 29th, July 29th, 1910. Sorry, I didn't bring my notes, just like Justin, I don't read, so So anyway, Dief is out on the streets selling newspapers. And along comes a prime minister who that day was laying a cornerstone at a college of the University of Saskatchewan. And Laurier actually buys a newspaper from this kid, gives him 25 cents. By the way, that was before just inflation, when 25 cents was a lot of money. And so the 2 of them talk for a little while. I think Laurier later in the day recounted this conversation with this young whippersnapper. And before the conversation could come to an end, Dief said, being a good conservative, said to himself, I'm not making any sales right now, I got to wrap this up. He said, sorry, Prime Minister, but I can't waste any more time with you, I have more newspapers to sell. But there you had a future Prime Minister who was then a paper boy. I was a paper boy too, by the way. And a current Prime Minister. And you'd think these 2 guys have nothing in common. One was a liberal, the other was a conservative, the other was a French Catholic, the other was a English-speaking Baptist. One was a Quebecer, the other was a prairie boy. Their terms were separated by almost half a century. But in fact, they had plenty in common. They both believed in the common wisdom and the common sense of the common people. when Laurier was asked, what is Canada's nationality? Now, in most places, a leader in that time would have defined nationality based on religion, ethnicity, or some other demarcation line of the sort. But he could do no such thing, because even back then, over a century ago, we were all mixed up, right? We had, of course, the First Peoples. We had the French, the English, the Scots, the Irish. Asian immigrants were already starting to arrive on our shores, so we couldn't define ourselves by ethnicity. We had Catholic and Protestant, and the arrival of new religions, new from a North American point of view, to our continent and to our country. And so he defined Canada and its nationality the following way. He said, Canada is free, and freedom is its nationality. Now, Diefenbaker would later sign the Bill of Rights, and on it he would write, I am a Canadian, a free Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to worship God in my own way, free to stand for what I think right, free to oppose what I believe wrong. This heritage of freedom I pledge to uphold for myself and all of mankind. Both of them believed in our ancient liberties, liberties that we had inherited and that had been passed down over 800 years from 1215, the Magna Carta, all the way to then and to now. Liberties that they believed for which they were the custodians. They were not the owners of that liberty. They were simply the guardians whose job it was to take the torch and pass it on, as Edmund Burke explained, a contract between the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. They understood. Thank you very much, Roy. Dr. Roy gave me a round of applause there. Thank you, Roy. Speaking of nonpartisanship, I'll be conservative in my remarks if you be liberal in your applause, all right? But thank you, Dr. Roy. And they weren't there to reinvent the universe. They didn't think that they were the living embodiment of God, that they could engineer humans and populations and recreate some brave new world. They were here to inherit the great gifts that ancestors before them had passed down, and they understood that Canada wasn't perfect, just as we look back at our history today and acknowledge it wasn't perfect. And you know what, though? Whenever we have gone wrong, it is because we have gotten away from those basic principles of human freedom and in favored too much state coercion and control, not the other way around. Now that common sense consensus guided our country for its first 100 years. It went into hibernation between about 1967 and 1984, and then it reawakened with the election of the great Brian Mulroney, who reversed the course of the previous decade and a half course. He inherited the country in a total mess. High unemployment and inflation, interest rates were in the double digits. The suicide rate had reached its highest level in Canadian history the year before, as so many people were losing their homes and their jobs as a direct result of excessive government control and coercion and the absolutely insane policies that had drowned our country in debt.